Where am I in this story now? I've become lost myself just telling it. These details are important though, and I hope it is at least starting to paint some of the picture that is the story of my life. I think that one thing my divorce did force on my mind was the need to accept change, the idea that things can still be all right even after a dramatic shift in life. Things might be different afterwards, and it might be painful to go through, but life continues. Though we might look back and regret certain events in our lives, certain actions we took, or things that we have said, we can find ourselves in the present better off and happier with life than we were previously. Of course, we might also find ourselves less happy, but we can only do what we are capable of at the time in either instance. So we move on. If there was a staircase that had a label for each step in the process that I was going through, I wouldn't know it. In trying to remember these events, it feels more like an oddly shaped ramp. The details are hazy, but I can remember the key moments. During the time I was separated and leading up towards finalizing the divorce, I moved in with my parents. I was trying my best to get my life corrected and grow in my faith and relationship with Christ again. I felt a stronger urge to make sure my boys were on the path to God too, and made sure to read devotionals with them and pray with them when I had them. I was worried that growing up in a broken family would make them far more likely to get caught up in the wrong things and that they would be on a path towards destruction. I was reading my Bible and praying and reading Christian books to help me on my journey. I was listening to sermons and actually, I'm going to stop describing what I recall myself to be at that time. I don't want to give the wrong impression either. I wasn't in some fired up state. It wasn't the same as being excited to go on a missions trip when I was a teenager. I found myself in this desperate situation and was trying to hold on to the lifesaver. Let's move forward in time to the point that the roller coaster took another dip. The brick wall in my spiritual struggle was unforgiving, and though that time I had hoped for something different, again, I couldn't maintain the passion. I started becoming less interested and less concerned, though still not doubting the reality of God, just unmoved by Him. As my lamp grew dimmer in the night, I met a wonderful, beautiful woman with a sweet disposition that I hadn't experienced before. I had started looking for someone to spend time with. I was lonely, but I wasn't ready for a relationship. On our first date, I found out she was a Christian, and that she happened to go to the same church that my parents were attending. I was still going to church, just a different one. As we started growing closer, she invited me to her church, and we started going there together. I was quickly falling in love with her, though I wouldn't be able to tell her for some time. Her passion for the Lord was rubbing off on me too, and I was reading and studying and listening to things to further my walk and understanding of God. At this time, I was a fan of people like Ravi Zacharias, and I was very impressed by his words and how eloquently he could talk about such important and deep topics. I wanted to gain that deep understanding too. This now brings me to the next event that stands out clearest in my memory like the Potholder 54 event. I started listening to a podcast called Trinities, as in multiple versions of the Trinity concept. The tagline of the show is, "Do you love God enough to think about Him?" It was a podcast by Dr. Dale Tuggy, a man who earned his PhD in philosophy from Brown University. I can't remember exactly how I came across it. Perhaps I was searching for shows about different doctrines so that I could gain that deep understanding of these topics I've had a lifelong interest in. Trinities was a Christian podcast, but I couldn't put my finger on what Dr. Tuggy's position was. You see, it turns out that the modern common idea of the Trinity has not always been the case. I wasn't aware that there had been that much controversy about it near the beginning of Christianity. Sure, the Jehovah's Witnesses had it all screwed up now, and so did the Mormons, but pretty much everyone knows how it works. Well, nobody really knows how it works, and nobody knows how it actually works. I started going through a similar experience as I did when I was listening to those Potholder 54 videos. But unlike the last time, where I was fairly dismissive, this time my true beliefs started to change. Dale Tuggy is not a Trinitarian, he is a Unitarian. By Unitarian, I simply mean someone who denies the Trinity and holds that the Father is God, and that Jesus and the Holy Spirit are not God, big G. This might sound ridiculous to someone who has thought one way their entire life, but a very good case can be made for this position. I was agreeing more each episode, the more I thought about it. I couldn't stop listening. I tried playing the show a little to my then-girlfriend, but she wasn't too interested in it, and I was afraid to push it at all. This subject can easily be labeled heresy, and though I felt that the reasons by which I was coming to the conclusion were justified, I also didn't think someone else would necessarily feel the same way that I did. This inability to communicate freely on these deeply held beliefs will continue to haunt me as I continue here. Something the Trinities podcast also did, and this is a secondary reason why this event is so critical to my tale, was teach me some basics about logic. We all use logic and we rely on it every day, but most of us, at least those around me, wouldn't delve into it deeply. I remember a couple of episodes of the podcast where Dr. Tuggy would illustrate how logic worked with the assistance of his LogicBot 2000. It was an enlightening experience, and it made such enormous sense. This was my first dose of real logic, and subsequently, the straw that was breaking the proverbial camel's back, though I didn't know it yet. One of the Trinity's episodes featured an interview with someone else who also had a podcast. It was called Rethinking Hell, and it was a show supporting a controversial view of hell. Rather than saying hell was a place of eternal torment, it described it as a temporary punishment before you are ultimately annihilated. They had reasons for the position, and it was certainly interesting to me. It really got me thinking about the entire concept of hell. I ended up having a big problem with hell the more I thought about it, and was unable to come to any acceptable solution to why God would do such a thing. I don't want to outline my arguments or my exact thought process here. My point right now is simply to relate the highlights in my journey. So, like the theory of evolution, I put the concept of hell in the I don't know category. I now had two major doctrines that I felt so strongly about in the past removed from the foundation of my belief. What would come next? As I continued listening to Trinities, I was also reading articles online about the issue, trying to come to a conclusion and resolve the apparent contradictions. Unable to find any reasonable solution, I eventually became convinced that Jesus was not ontologically the same as the Father, nor could he be. The Trinity concept is a mystery. In fact, you aren't really even supposed to understand it. This wasn't an I don't know situation, though. Going to church and worshiping Sunday mornings, I would feel uneasy about the worship of Jesus, not sure how to treat the subject. I realized that every knee should bow, and I knew that Jesus had a very honored position, that he was elevated to the right hand of God himself. I knew that Jesus died for me, and that he was still required for salvation. That is what God wanted. This was God's plan since the beginning, but it was still confusing. It was new to me, but it wouldn't last long enough for me to construct a new system of belief around. Connected to this, and yet another thing I hadn't put much thought into before, was how that salvation worked. What was actually happening through the atonement? I tried to find some answers, and there just isn't very much good information on the topic, at least that I was able to come across. The Trinities podcast did have an episode talking about it. Dr. Tuggy was interviewing Dr. Joshua Thoreau, who has written on the subject. I listened to that episode several times. I just couldn't get it. Nothing clicked. It was as if I was blocked on some cosmic level from understanding it. And yet, it all hinged on that historical event. Ultimately, like the Trinity, this too was what people called a mystery. The solid foundation I thought my life had been built on didn't seem as solid anymore. The unassailable giant that held me above the confusion of the world was starting to seem like a shadow in the mist, not what I thought it was the more I examined it. I could have stopped there, and maybe I should have. I could have lived out the rest of my life enjoying the bliss that comes with knowing your Creator is keeping track of everything. He was even counting the number of hairs on my head, a task that was getting easier these days. I could not resist the forbidden fruit, though. It might not have been the sweetest fruit, but it had something better than taste. It had substance. I was grappling with myself in my head as my intellect and mind was starting to depart from what I traditionally held to be true. It was the intellect and mind that God gave me to figure it all out, wasn't it? I am only ever capable of coming to conclusions based on reasons afforded to me from my intellect at the time, whether that mind is a gift from God or not.